Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbos.
I don't know if I should do like a trigger warning.
A trigger warning?
I'm going to talk about the election. And I'm going to talk about Torah.
Who's surprised?
I just feel like I should frame that, you know? So we're going to take a deep breath. We're going to settle in. And we're going to be in this space together. And I feel very lucky to have this community to speak frankly with. So perhaps it was naive of me to go to bed on Tuesday with a sense of optimism. I mean, look, we all knew that it was going to be a very close race, but among the people in my life, there was sufficient enthusiasm, or among my more leftist friends, political pragmatism, for me to believe that Kamala Harris would be our next president. And on the eve of the election, pollsters and political analysts that I trusted have been posting maps with enough states colored blue, maybe even Iowa, to secure a win. And so even when North Carolina was called for Trump right as I was shutting off my phone for bed, I thought that I would wake up to history in the making. And instead, I woke up to a country that I felt I didn't recognize. How could this be happening? I mean, how could this be happening? So many people I know, so many activists that I admire had been working for the past 8 years to loosen the grip of Trumpism on our nation, and instead, MAGA have been given an uncontestable mandate. So I'm not going to talk about how we got here, although like so many others, I have plenty of thoughts on that. And I think a sober retrospective will be necessary for the fight to come. But I don't think it's very helpful at this hour. Right now, what we need most, what I need most, is to sit with what is and allow ourselves the space to hold the sadness and the anger and the disappointment and the exhaustion and the overwhelming sense that we don't know what lies ahead, and that's really scary. All of it, all that we might be feeling tonight. This is hard. This is hard. This is hard because these last few months have felt like a battle for the soul of America, pitting the best of who we are, tolerance and compassion and care for the common good, against the darkest impulses of tribalism. This is hard because Trump and others like him ran on a campaign of divisiveness and discrimination and disinformation. Many of us in this room found ourselves and the people we love in the crosshairs of his vitriol. We worry, and for very good reason, how the hate that shaped his rhetoric will remake this country in its image. It's not lost on me that it was only 6 years ago that a shooter murdered 11 Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue, motivated by anti-immigrant conspiracy myths. We know where Trump's words can lead, and it's terrifying to imagine more of it. This is hard because it's not just about us versus them. If you heard enough of my sermons, you know I don't really believe in that. But us and the people in the town next door, and our neighbors down the street, maybe even family members who are sitting across the table from us this holiday season. And this week, as we held each other in grief, as my friends who immigrated to this country wondered if this election signaled the countdown for the deportation, as my black and brown friends, as my female friends mourned the election of a racist, a convicted felon and rapist over a qualified woman of color, as my queer and trans friends shared information for mutual aid and crisis lifelines, I watched people I knew, not just colleagues, but cousins of mine, celebrate the resurgence of MAGA. And I kept returning to this quote by Dr. Anthony Fauci, which has been making its rounds on social media again. I don't know how to explain to you that you should care for other people. So I began to wonder if this is how Abraham and Sarah felt back when they were still called Avram and Sarai, when they first heard God's call to become the progenitors of a people who would walk through this world in a radically new way. We read the beginning of their story this week. Lech lecha, God tells them, go out from your native land, from your birthplace, from your ancestral home to the land that I will show you. God reveals to them the promise of what might be. A goy gadol, a great nation, not defined by might nor by power, but shaped by its ethical tradition and guided by the audacious claim that all human beings are imprinted with the divine stamp of a single creator and are therefore of inherent dignity and worth. So we're told that Avram is 75 years old when he leaves Haran, Sarai 65, which means they've been living in Mesopotamia for a few decades. And according to the Torah, quite comfortably as well. They've amassed wealth. They have a household of slaves and servants. And then one morning they wake up to a new possibility that the idols they had been worshiping, that the social structures they had benefited from, that the norms that they had become accustomed to were not only false, but fundamentally flawed. The dissonance between the possibility of what could be and the reality in which they found themselves became unignorable, and how unbearable it must have been for them to see their friends and family go about like there's nothing wrong, or worse, guard and maintain systems that, at least to Avram and Sarai, were clearly in need of reform, if not revolution. And so suddenly the place that they had called home for their entire lives didn't feel like home at all. And so, as the story goes, Avram and Sarai set out for the land of Canaan. In the Torah, it's a journey that spans about 2 verses, but topographically, this is a distance of about 500 miles, and I looked this up. For the average person with breaks to eat and to sleep, this would take them at least a month by foot. And I share this to underscore the fact that their decision to leave Haran should not be taken lightly. This was millennia before maps could tell us where we were or where we were going. They were quite literally walking into the unknown, chasing the promise of a better future that had no guarantee of coming to fruition. And remember, they had only just met the character of God, right? Like, unlike their descendants, who we'll meet in a few chapters, they didn't have the ancestral memory of God fulfilling God's promises. This was an entirely new being to them. And so when they finally arrive in Shechem, God says, see this land? See this land? This is the place where your children will live and grow old, and your children's children and their children as well. And I can only imagine how relieved Avram and Sarai must have felt after such a long journey. Somehow the incredible risk they took paid off. And so Avram builds an altar in thanksgiving. And they travel a bit further to Beit El, into the beautiful hill country to the west of the Jordan River, and Avram builds an altar in thanksgiving there, and little by little, they wander across this promised land, building altars to God, and make their way to the Negev, when suddenly there is a famine. And this famine is so terrible. It is so devastating. They are forced to leave their new home and travel hundreds of miles more across the desolate wilderness to Egypt. In this moment, the moment we're standing right now, I feel their despair. I feel their despair. They had worked so hard to reach this place, this land that God had promised them, and for what? And for what? They're homeless and childless, strangers in a strange land. And I understand how this could have been the end of their story. Yet rather than hold on to what they had hoped would happen, once the moment for that hope had passed, they meet their new reality and change course, guided by the promise of what might become, what might still happen, in what the writer Rebecca Solnit calls the spaciousness of uncertainty. They navigate a hostile environment in Egypt. It's not fun for them there. They somehow make their way back to the Negev. They survive war between the great nations of that time. They fight and they make peace with their neighbors. They hold each other through the heartbreak of infertility and attempt to repair their broken home. And at the end of our parasha, still waiting for the birth of that child, they receive new names in recognition of their persistent pursuit of what was promised. You will be called Abraham and Sarah, God says, a sign of the covenant between us. Just as you have upheld your faith, despite all that's happened to you, I will uphold mine. I'm reminded of a saying that was taught to me by a tour guide in Jordan many years ago. She was a remarkable person, the first woman to become a state-certified tour guide in her country. And she said, God will meet you halfway, but only if you go halfway. God will meet you halfway, but only if you go halfway. This is not the time to give up. I don't think we've reached halfway yet. When she conceded the election on Wednesday, Vice President Harris reminded us that she would often say, when we fight, we win. Sometimes the fight takes a while. As Jews, we are inheritors of the long fight. So are women, so are people of color, so are people with disabilities and chronic illnesses, so are queer folks. We stand on the shoulders of countless people who could have given up hope, who instead of taking the next step on their journey, could have sat down and stayed where they were and ended the fight out of exhaustion. And I don't think any of us would have blamed them given their circumstances. Yet here we are. Here we are because of them. Now, I can't speak to you as a woman or a person of color or a person with a disability or chronic illness or the many other people who find a story of insistence and persistence woven through their DNA. But I can speak to you as a Jew, and I can speak to you as a queer man. The columnist Louis Staples wrote shortly after the election, strangely, it's moments like this that I feel most lucky to be queer. I think about our elders, how hopeless they must have felt, how easy it would have been to give up, but they fought for the life that I get to live today. And he says, what an insult it would be to them to succumb to despair. I think about our elders, Abraham and Sarah, who wandered from place to place until they died, not knowing that as they walked, they marked a path for their children and their children's children and the many generations to follow. I think about their son Isaac, who set out on a journey of his own and rebuilt the trail of altars that his parents had left behind. And I think about Jacob, who with his family is forced to migrate to Egypt, following the very same path walked by his grandparents, and there becomes a nation atzum v'rav, many and numerous, and his son, Joseph, who not only saves his people, but the entire region from famine, when only 4 generations earlier, a similar disaster had only meant death. None of them lived to see the fulfillment of the promise that compelled Abraham and Sarah to leave Haran. But each of them walked us just a little bit closer to its demand for collective liberation, its vision of a world shaped by justice and compassion. And not only were they transformed by this journey, we all were, both the people who helped them along the way, and yes, also the people who stood in their path, all of us, for the better. Now, I can't tell you what tomorrow is going to bring, nor can we predict what is going to happen over the next 4 years, although we can be prepared by strengthening our communities and showing up for one another, even when we disagree, because we will need to be sometimes in very uncomfortable coalitions to meet the darkness ahead of us. We are looking down a very difficult road. And after the year that we have had, after the year that we have had as individuals and as a people, as Jews, I am so sorry for that. I am so sorry for that. I had hoped for easier times ahead. Or at the very least, I'd hope for one less dumpster fire to contend with. But here we are. Reflecting on living through unprecedented times yet again, Rebecca Solnit says that we should neither be optimists who think that everything will be fine regardless of what we do, nor should we be pessimists who think that nothing will be okay regardless of what we do. She writes that now is the time for hope, and hope is the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact are not things that we can know beforehand. What you do matters. What you do matters, and I know this. We know this to be true because this is the lesson of the history that we inherit as a people. And maybe that's why the rabbis insist that we keep reading it on repeat year after year to remind us of this fact, knowing that this lesson would be especially needed in times like this. So I want to ask you, in this moment, when it all feels like it is crashing down around us, what is your prayer for the world? What is your prayer for the world? Maybe it's the same prayer that you've always had. Maybe it's the same prayer you had earlier this week, and now we're just going to have to find a new way to get there. Or maybe your prayer has changed. What is your prayer for the world? When the darkness feels overwhelming, may your prayer be a light, guiding you to take the next step, knowing that that step matters not only for you and for us, but also for that person, perhaps generations from now, who will set out on a journey of their own toward a better future, finding that the path has already been marked for them by you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.